Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to help you answer two key exam questions that are linked to the topic rural geography, especially when referring specifically to the changes that have been happening in farming and in rural areas in general in developing countries. So the key here is we're dealing with countries in the less developed world. What you will have done so far is you'll have considered the problems that farmers in the developing world experience in producing food and some of the limitations and the impact those limitations have. And in today's lesson, I want to start by looking at the diagram, which you can see in front of you of a modern farming landscape that you might be familiar with in the developed world. You might see something like this in Scotland, but you are less likely to see it in the developing world, although increasingly more and more farming is shifting to this way of producing food. So what are the key changes? Well, you can see a number of annotations around this photo that indicate the main changes that have happened in farming that are very different from what we were looking at last lesson. So let's just have a little consider about what the question could be. So the first question is explain how farmers in developing countries can increase crop outputs. So to answer that, you need to examine the changes. And the second question we're going to deal with is to describe in detail the impact that any changes made by farmers could have on the landscape. And those could be positive impacts or they could be negative impacts. Now, as I go through each question, I'll start with question one. I will refer mainly to this table of information here and just add a little bit more explanation to the points so you can then write out each point in detail. Okay, so let's get started. How to explain how farmers in developed countries can increase outputs? Well, if they start adopting the use of machines instead of basic handheld tools, then they are able to work the land much quicker because machines can work faster than humans and thereby produce more food. Okay. The second thing they can do is move away from working small fields to working much larger fields. So that happens when you merge multiple small fields together to make one much larger field. This allows them to produce a lot more food, and it also allows them to use large machines which would not be usable in small field areas. That therefore increases the amount of food they can produce on the land. If their communities get connected up to major cities by maybe proper roads or tarmacked roads, and if electricity lines are brought in, that allows them to buy machines to process the food they're producing, and it also allows them to quickly get their food to market rather than using horse and carts, for example, which obviously allows them to increase the amount of food they're producing. Many farmers are now moving their production indoors, not relying on directly heat from the sun, but actually putting their food into greenhouses. This means that they can cultivate all year round, especially in areas where they might only be able to have one crop because it's a seasonal area, like in the more mountainous regions of India. Now with greenhouses, they can cultivate all year long because greenhouses are climate controlled. They're the same temperature all the time. Another change they can make is they can introduce drainage systems to their fields rather than just relying on the water naturally draining through the soil. What this means is during periods of heavy rain, the fields won't become flooded, which would destroy or damage the crops. So drainage systems allow crops to drain properly and ensure that there is no damage, and that increases the amount of food they're producing. Another change is they can move away from just using basic seeds to using genetically modified seeds, or what we call high-yield variety seeds. This means that each seed will produce a much bigger crop, which will increase the yield of the farmer. And also because these genetically modified seeds are often pest-resistant, they're less likely to be eaten by bugs, and therefore their actual crop at the end of the year will be significantly increased. Right, well, another change they can make is because they're using machines, they can get away from employing lots of people and end up just relying on a few people to work the land. This means they have to pay less for the large workforce, which means they save money and they can invest that money in other things. Okay. Many farmers are now moving away from growing more traditional crops like rice to growing cash crops. These are crops that are often sold on international markets and trade at much higher values. A very good example of a cash crop is tobacco, for example, and that it increases the earnings that farmers make. A significant change is where farmers move away from just relying on the water that comes out of the sky, and they start to rely on what's called an irrigation system. So these are watering pipes that provide a continual covering of water to the crops all year long, especially during the drier periods. So if they introduce irrigation systems, the crops will get a consistent amount of water, which means they'll grow much more effectively. And two more changes that I'll quickly refer to. We can put them together. Farmers are increasingly using more fertilizers, which means crops grow quicker and more effectively. And they're also increasingly using more pesticides, which offers a natural protection to the crop from insects and reduces the amount that's lost to insect damage, which increases farmers' profits. Right, so far, if you've been writing this down, you'll have picked up a whole range of changes, which I've not just mentioned the change, and that's from what it was before to what it was after, but then I've also explained how that increases the farmers' profits or their outputs. Let's deal with the second one. What is the impact of these changes? And let's deal with some positive impacts. Okay, so if a farmer is increasing the amount of money they're making because they've got more harvests, that allows them to further invest in more machines, which means that they can further increase the amount of money they make. Second of all, a farmer with more money can afford more goods and services, can improve the actual quality of their life. They can live in a better home with electricity, they can afford a television, for example. And that just increases their general standard of living. A third impact is that the farmer no longer needs to have large families because he doesn't need children for the workforce. So family sizes decrease, which reduces the population pressure in countries. Fourth advantage of farmers making changes is that because children are no longer needed to work on the farm, they're more likely to be able to get an education. And because the farmer's now earning money, farmers are more likely to be able to afford that education. And that means that the next generation of children, rather than having to be farmers, may be able to access other occupations, which is further going to increase the wealth of the country. On a negative side, changes often see small farms end up being consumed by larger farms, where the farmer with the most money ends up buying up the land from the poorer farmers. And many of these poorer farmers then get forced off the land and end up in shanty towns in cities in the developing world, because their land is no longer owned by them and is owned by these large-scale farmers. Another negative is an increased reliance on pesticides and fertilizers. Means farmers often have to borrow a lot of money in order to afford these things, and if they don't make substantial profits, they can end up getting into debt, which can ultimately lead to them losing their land. Okay, and one final change with GM crops as well as fertilizers and pesticides. There's increasing environmental concerns that things like fertilizers and pesticides and GM crops can damage the environment, damage wildlife, as well as other species growing in the natural world. So there are a range of positive and negative impacts. You can see them listed here as advantages and disadvantages of the changes. So you're looking to include 6 ideas. So take this lesson video and answer both questions, ensuring that you have 6 ideas for both of